Good evening, everyone. Thank you for your participation in this evening's live webinar. The Interactive Metronome 360. This is an e-clinic and at-home delivery model presented by Dr. Douglas Steffi, behavioral optometrist and educator. And without further ado, I will hand the controls over to Dr. Steffi.
Well, thank you. And I'm really looking forward to the time tonight. And I'm hoping at the end of it, there's at least one or two things that you can go do tomorrow as part of your action plan. And I know whenever I attend events, I've had to temper my expectations over the years. And I really am of the frame of mind these days that if I can leave an event with one or two things that I could implement tomorrow or next week, then I will have considered that time a success. And having said that, I can make this really simple. If you're an in-office IM provider and you're debating whether or not you should add in IM home to your practice, yes. And if you're debating whether or not you should become an interactive metronome provider, the answer is a resounding yes. So with having said that, thank you for attending tonight, and that's the end of the talk. No, I'm just kidding. We're not getting off that easy. So let me tell you a little bit about myself first. I used to be an assistant professor, clinical professor at an optometry school out here in California, but it was in the ocular disease department. It wasn't in the vision therapy department. It wasn't in the developmental department. It was in ocular disease. But when I bought this practice that I'm in currently back in 1988, within that first week, I realized that we were going to have to provide vision therapy through the office because it doesn't take that much effort to find people that need the work. So while I was still teaching quite a bit, I had over the years a number of optometrists that would fill in for me. Most all of them had completed a one-year residency after optometry school in pediatrics and vision therapy. And it was in the late winter of 97 that I read a book called Why Our Children Can't Read and What We Can Do About It. And I went and got trained in that reading method in the spring of 97. When I was still teaching full-time at the optometry school, I had gone back to graduate school and got my master's degree in education and curriculum development, for what that's worth. But I got trained in this reading method. I got hooked up with a number of reading therapists across the country. We were on a listserv that had common interests in how do we help kids learn how to read better. I was the only optometrist in the group. Most of the people were speech and language folks, some educational therapists, some OTs, and some reading tutors. And I was the lone vision guy. Well, there was a colleague of mine who lived a few miles from me that said, "Hey, have you ever heard of Interactive Metronome?" And I'm like, "No, what is that?" And so I looked it up back probably in 98 or 99 and was intrigued, but my plate was pretty full with the things that I was doing at the time. And around that same window, I stumbled across a book titled Conversations with Neil's Brain. And it was written by a neurosurgeon and a neuropsychologist. And Neil was the theoretical patient he was going to have brain surgery for uncontrolled epilepsy. And each chapter in this book went through a different brain function. And what does it mean for us? And what did it mean for Neil? And what did it mean for the neurosurgeon who was going to take out part of Neil's brain to try to control his seizures without gorking him out in the process? And I can still almost tell you to this day that 2/3 of the way through the book, there's a chapter about how we string things together. And I don't even remember the details of the chapter. All I know is that I read that chapter on a weekend. And in the back of my mind was percolating Interactive Metronome. And I read that chapter. I came in that Monday morning. I called up the folks, and I believe at that point they were still in Michigan, not in Florida like they are now. And I basically said, I don't really know what you guys do or what you have, but I'm pretty convinced I need it. So hook me up. What do I have to do to order and get trained? And that's been almost 20 years ago. And I would not even hardly consider practicing the way I practice without Interactive Metronome being a core part of my model. And I'm hoping by the end of tonight, if you're on the fence, you're going to feel the same way I did. And if you're not on the fence and you've already bought in, then I'm just going to reiterate what you're doing right, and then broaden your consideration of some other factors that maybe you hadn't quite figured on. And then let me go back to the listserv that I used to be on. So back in the late 90s, before there was such a thing as I Am Home, I was on this list, and there were people all over the country, and I would bring up Interactive Metronome. And I say, look, here's the website, go check it out. This is something you really should consider. And then they'd email me back and they'd say, well, that sounds a lot like my kid, but the closest provider is 2 states away. Like, how's that going to work? And so, again, back before there was a home version, I end up having 3 of the full-on in-office kits. And I took the risk of mailing the kit to somebody across the country with the expectation that they were going to mail it back to me. and I would treat them remotely before there was such a thing as remote training, because I couldn't know what I knew and not try to figure out a way to help them help their own selves or their own kids. So again, I am grateful every day that I got to know Interactive Metronome and read that book, and it prompted me to change what I was doing, which in part leads me, and let's see if we can have success doing this. I am hopeful. I can do this. I'm going to bring up one of the handouts, and the handouts that are included in tonight's talk, they all should be downloadable. And so you should be able to download them and review them at length at a different time. But I want to talk about these 14 factors. And is it an all-inclusive list? No, I'm not going to pretend like it is. But it is a model that I have morphed into really over the last 20 years. And it wasn't the way I started out in practice, because much of this I was taught about in optometry school, but some of it I wasn't. And Interactive Metronome as a representation wasn't around when I went to optometry school. I would say that there were other treatment modalities that were Interactive Metronome-like, but it pales in comparison to what Interactive Metronome really is and what it's capable of doing. But I at least want to introduce you to this model so that you can adopt it into your own thinking and the kids or adults that you see, and to really ensure that you're finding resources available to you that will help fill in any of the gaps in this model that you're not able to fully implement and do yourself. So we start off with eyesight, and namely visual acuity, right? That's the holy grail of people going to the optometrist, and they want to know if they can see 20/20 and what is it going to take if they can't. Well, in my model, you're going to realize that seeing 20/20 is like a tiny dot in this big model. But seeing 20/20 is important. So if you have unmet prescription needs, then yes, you need a prescription in order to get you to 20/20, but there's so much more at stake. Which leads me to step number 2, visual efficiency skills. So in layperson's terms, there's eye focusing, eye teaming, and eye tracking. And after we go through this handout, I might bring up a different screen and kind of talk my way through that. But eye focusing, eye tracking, and eye teaming. And why is this important? Because most of the skills that we're going to talk about should be effortless for you, meaning it should cost no amount of cognitive resources or attention for the things that we are talking about right now. Because you should have all of your cognitive abilities available to you to process your environment and to create an action plan, motor, language, thinking about how you're going to act upon the processing of your environment. So, for example, your brain should not have to spend any of its attentional resources in trying to figure out where to look, how long to look for, what to look at, how to process what it is that you're looking at, and again, how to act upon the looking. So where to look, when to look, and how long to look for should be effortless. So that if it is effortless, you can then hopefully begin to build on your visual perceptual skills. And here's something to tell you, right? So roughly 80% of the human brain is allocated to the processing of visual information. I'll even go one better than that. There is estimated to be 3 million sensory nerve fibers feeding information to the brain: vision, auditory, taste, touch, and smell. 3 million. And of that 3 million fibers, there's estimated to be 30,000 per ear, 3,000 per fingertip, 17,000 touch receptors in our face, and 1.2 million neurons per eye. And let that resonate for just a minute. 2.4 of the 3 million sensory inputs that our brain is perceiving at any instant in time is driven through your visual system. And by way of example, vision can certainly affect the way you move. Vision can affect the way you hear. Vision can affect the way you smell and taste. It's a bully on all these other senses. And a really good example is there was some research published several years ago that some neuroscientists went over to some wine festival in France, I believe. The country's not relevant, but let's say France. And they wanted to know if vision would affect these wine connoisseurs' ability to taste and smell wine. So they took a tasteless and odorless dye and dyed white wine red. Now, I don't know much about wine, but certainly as weak as my palate is, red wine tastes very different than white. But when they took white wine and colored it in this way, a good number of the people, because it looked like a red wine, it changed the way it tasted and smelled to them. Just because they had these preconceived expectation that it was a red wine, and it changed their sensory experience. So these visual perceptual skills are affected by focusing, tracking, and teaming, because you are likely to be challenged to allocate enough attentional resources to the development of your visual perceptual skills if your visual skills and your attentional resources are being spent on where to look, when to look, and how long to look for. And I will likely circle back to this, but when it comes to developing focusing, tracking, and teaming skills, well, the development of those skills are going to be compromised if you don't yet have good postural control of your body in space. And a colleague of mine, an optometric colleague of mine who practices in Israel, who I'm never going to meet except for this other email list that I participate in, brought up an article in the last 5 or 6 weeks that was published by an occupational therapist back in the mid-'80s with a discussion about visual aspects of postural control. So when you're a little kid trying to figure out how your body parts work and how you get them to synchronize with each other, or if you're an older student who never learned those skills, or if you've had a brain injury of some kind, whether it's a traumatic brain injury or you've spiked a fever and basically cooked your brain a little bit, or you've had a systemic infection that had spillover effect into the brain and how it contributed to your brain being super inflamed. If there's postural issues anywhere in that discussion, then your brain's got to allocate much of its visual abilities just to keep track of where your body is in space. And again, if that's a siphon of visual abilities, then your visual perception's likely to suffer, as is your focusing, tracking, and teaming skills. So the model that I have morphed into, even though focusing, tracking, and teaming is a core part of what I'm going to measure and report in a summary letter that I'm going to write, whether you've had a TBI or your kid with an IEP or a 504 plan, or should have an IEP or a 504 plan, I'm going to report those skills, but it's probably not where I'm going to start your therapy. And I'm going to briefly mention it here, but I will bring it up again in a little while. But in my therapy model, there's really mostly 4 primary stages, and I do them in a development what I think is developmentally appropriate way. I'm not saying that I've got the golden ticket to this discussion, and when we get to the end of my part of the talk, I'm going to be interested in seeing some of your questions and comments, because I expect to learn a thing or two from all of you with the expertise that you bring to this table. So I'm hopeful that I'm going to learn some other things too. But having said that, so as a rule of thumb, my model of treatment, stage 1, as an example, is going to talk about inflammation, silent inflammation at a cellular level, gut function, microbiome, retained primitive reflexes, and interactive metronome. That and as I've learned more over the years and try to continue to read as much as I can, I've come to the conclusion that interactive metronome and what it really represents could go perhaps by 3 different names. And I dance around between the 3. So sometimes I refer to it as a millisecond timing clock. That is relatively self-evident. I sometimes refer to it as magnocellular motor neurons. And I'm hopefully going to talk about magnocellular motor, magnocellular auditory, magnocellular vision in a little while. But magnocellular motor output or beat competency, right? How easily can you do some physical movement to a beat? And I would love to know our ancestors, and I would love to know who came up with patty cake. Because patty cake is an ancestral version of interactive metronome, right? We sing a melody and clap that baby's hands in conjunction with that beat because we intuitively know that there was something magical about getting that baby's body to move in rhythm. And there was a book, I'm going to forget the name of it, but there was a book written probably in the 1930s or 40s. And it went something along the line to the beat of a different drum, but it was something like that. And really the whole book was talking about rhythm and movement. And it was a whole bunch of activities designed to work on rhythm and movement, which leads me to an experience I had probably 15 years ago. There was a 10-year-old high functioning autistic kid who had been to my practice for the focusing, tracking, and teaming assessment, but he had not been back for an interactive metronome assessment. And he had an upcoming IEP meeting, and the mom had called me and she said, the school-based OT is going to discontinue her therapy. Okay. Fair enough. I'm like, why don't you come in though? Let me do the interactive metronome screening. I will call into that IEP meeting if his outcomes are poor, and we can have a chat about what does this mean. And so I called into this IEP meeting, and the school-based OT said, yep, there's nothing more that I can do or need to do. So I'm discontinuing OT services. And the conversation that we had went something along the lines of this. And I said, well, okay, who might argue? I don't fully know what you've done, but let me share with you and the team that this kid just came to back in my office 2 days ago, and his millisecond timing clock is supposed to be in the 55 to 79 millisecond range, and it's up in the high 200s. So I'm curious to know if you're, have you done an interactive metronome screening with him? Well, no, but I've heard of it. No, I didn't ask you if you've heard of interactive metronome. I asked you if you've ever measured his timing. Well, no. Okay, so you don't have the interactive metronome device. No, I don't have it. Have you been through their training to know about it? No, I've not been through their training. Okay. But I do motor planning and sequencing therapy, Dr. Steffi. I said, I'm not arguing that. But what I am asking is, if you were doing motor planning and sequencing therapy in a traditional way that you provide it, but you don't know anything about this kid's timing, how do you know that you're not embedding his bad timing into his neurology? And then there was silence on the phone, an uncomfortably length of silence. And what I want you to take away from this call tonight, well, there's a number of things I want you to take away from this call tonight. And one of them, again, is if you're on the fence about IMs, stop being on the fence and just go get trained. I'll periodically will probably say that through the evening because it's spectacular. And you'll wonder how you ever practice without it if you don't already have it. And then we'll talk a little bit later about the model that I've adopted and how I use IM Home as opposed to the in-office version. So I'm not going to forget about sharing my experiences with you in that regard. So eventually we had to get to the point where, well, if you don't know the kid's timing and you're not doing anything to modify the timing, then the reality is you're probably embedding that bad timing into their neurology. And I just don't find that acceptable. And I'm hoping that you won't either. But let's motor on in my model. So number 4, language comprehension. Well, there's listening comprehension and there's reading comprehension. And I would venture to tell you that both of them can be affected if you've got poor timing. Because as you likely know, or maybe you don't, and as I understand the effects that interactive metronome has on the brain, that it is, to the best of our understanding, helping the brain integrate and synchronize the cerebellum and the parietal and the frontal lobes, and to get them to oscillate in synchrony with each other, and to give you more easy access to your attentional control networks so that you don't have to allocate as much of your attention, your attentional resources, to paying attention. And again, I'll circle back to the idea behind that as well. So suffice it to say that interactive metronome is one of the pieces that can affect listening comprehension and reading comprehension. And there's lots of others that we'll continue to work our way through. So number 5 on my list is working memory. Basically, aspects of processing speed, ability to multitask, how much information can you hold in mind, store, retrieve, and manipulate, and then components of selective attention, sustained attention, and divided attention. And I use either the learning efficiency test or the test of information processing skills, which is a newer version of the learning efficiency test. So the LET2 or the TIPS, and I will tell you that both of those measurements are measuring something wildly different than the working memory index on the WISC. So one of the things that I want to encourage you is, if you are reading other people's testing outcomes, you want to fully understand how that data is collected and reported. Because the working memory index on the WISC is not even in the same ballpark as the LET2 or the TIPS. So just keep that in the back of your mind when you contemplate working memory outcomes. Then there's magnocellular vision. So relatively speaking, in visual terms, there's magnocellular neurons and there's parvocellular neurons. Parvo means little, magno means big. So it's basically how many visual neurons can we pack in a square millimeter of space. If they're little neurons, you can pack more of them into 1 square millimeter. And if you pack more visual neurons into the same amount of space, your brain is perceiving more detail than if you can only pack a certain number of larger neurons in the same amount of space. So parvocellular input to the brain is really the what visual pathway, and magnocellular vision is the where visual pathway. So magnocellular vision is more related to motion processing and doing it under low contrast conditions, not black on white like on the standard eye chart as it relates to visual acuity. So magnocellular vision is really relative. Can you see fast under low contrast conditions? And parvo is the what pathway. What is it that I'm looking at? And the reason I want you to have some insight into that tonight is because I'm telling you that your brain is challenged to know what to look at if it doesn't know where to look. So if your magnocellular or your motion processing system is working poorly, it means that you're almost by default going to have some trouble with focusing, tracking, and teaming, because you can't figure out what to look at, again, if you can't figure out where to look. And I've got some eye teaming measurements at looking at the brain's ability to cross and uncross the eyes. And I'll try not to forget to demonstrate that and the difference between when the target is moving versus when the target is not moving. But suffice it to say that and just so you know, there's a magnocellular visual theory of dyslexia. And I could send you an article too, and anybody's welcome to email me if you want information, anything expanded on what I'm talking about tonight. Happy to share information with you. But I've also got an article or two that relates magnocellular visual abilities to the development of phonological processing skills. And lest you think that phonological processing is only a language or an auditory related ability, I'm here to tell you it is not. And I'll give you a good example. So I'm going to have you do in your mind a phoneme manipulation task. The fancy word for that is called elision. I don't know why they picked that word, but phoneme manipulation. So for example, if I say the word cat and I ask you to repeat it and you all say to yourselves cat, and then I say, well, say that again, but without the k sound. Well, odds are that that's pretty simple. So you're going to say at. And on a related note, if I say the word snail, and then I tell you, well, say it again, but take out the n sound. Of course, the word should be sail. Now, and here's what's kind of fun and interesting. Most of you are going to have pictured the letters S-N-A-I-L and then spliced out the letter N and then re-imaged what was left over and then basically just read what you saw in your mind. But there's going to be a handful of you, perhaps, that didn't picture the letters, but actually pictured a snail. And then may or may not have had any trouble about splicing out the n sound. And generally speaking, most all of you should not have problems with that because hopefully you have learned our alphabetic writing system and are a reasonably accurate speller so that you can picture those letters in the manner in which I'm describing them. But if you're a beginning reader and I'm asking you to play with sounds and words, but I haven't taught you our alphabetic symbols yet, you are limited to what you hear. And that's not as easy to do if you can't anchor the sounds concretely by attaching the sounds to a sound picture, and namely the letters. And then we're back to how your visual skills affect your development of phonological processing. Number 8 on our list is rapid naming speed. Rapid naming speed is an interesting enigma. And I've seen rapid naming speed immediately get better if I put on a pair of glasses with color or prism. I've seen it get better after we've done magnocellular vision. I've seen it get better after we've done binocular vision, namely focusing and teaming. I've seen it get better after working memory, and I've seen it persist as an issue. And that's an interesting conundrum, especially after you've treated all these other things. You might still be left with a rapid naming speed deficit. Motor planning and sequencing. Well, yes, we're talking about the brain's ability to organize time and space. And again, Interactive Metronome does that in spades. And as far as I know, there is nothing else like it because it allows you to create a baseline. Okay, I've just measured your timing clock. You've done the 14 activities in the long form assessment, and I can show you what your timing clock looks like versus what it should look like. And then I can have some conversation with you about the way it likely shows up in real life. And then the therapy version that we have to talk about will give you the feedback auditorily or visually about whether you're too fast or too slow, so that your brain now has an opportunity to change itself. And isn't that the key? You've got to have feedback in order to change your behavior. And if you're not getting any feedback, then you're just going to continue to embed your bad timing into your neurology until it becomes a habit. And until we get your brain to change itself to create a new habit, then you're going to stuck accessing the old one. And now I'm going to tell you about another book titled The Boy Who Could Run But Not Walk. And that book was written by a neonatologist who originally got trained as a conventional Western trained physician in Canada, and then really started contemplating what she was doing with her population of infants that were being diagnosed with cerebral palsy, and that she changed her thinking to really look at these kids as having a traumatic brain injury and then treating them very differently from the very beginning of their life, and the effects that she had on their outcomes. And it went so against the grain with how her Western trained colleagues were perceiving her body of work that she really became a pariah in her own field. And then she left the hospital that she was working at and went and opened her private practice. And there was a number of things. That book is spectacular, and so you should add it to your reading list. But the one takeaway that really has stuck with me, and I probably bring it up for discussion once a week with other people: habit hides recovery. Habit hides recovery. So we've got to get your brain to change itself by accessing your neuroplastic abilities, and then practice the right things with the right feedback long enough to get your brain to change itself. And when we get your brain to change itself, it won't unlearn what you have now learned. So, for example, an analogy I give to a lot of people, I say, well, look, can you still remember when you learned how to ride a bike? And they say, yes, I can remember that. Okay. Well, once you did that, your brain changed itself. And you could not get on a bike for 5 or 10 years and then get back on, and your brain will access that software and you'll be off to the races again in no time flat. Now, if you could get to be 30 years old, and if nobody ever gave you an opportunity to ride a bike, well, you'll have some of the same difficulty that a younger kid has in learning how to ride a bike, because you've never had a chance to get your brain to change itself to do that. But if your motor planning and timing skills are good and all your visual skills are good, as an adult, you won't suffer the same consequences that we did when we were younger kids trying to learn how to ride a bike. But if your vision and your timing skills are poor, you'll have the same problems. And I would argue the same thing with jumping rope, right? If you're an adult and jump rope like you have 2 left feet, well, you likely have an interactive metronome problem, retained primitive reflexes, magnocellular or binocular vision problems, or any combination of the above. All right. And then number 10, stress and anxiety. Well, let's go back to my analogy earlier about the neuroanatomy with 2.4 of our 3 million sensory inputs tied up in vision. Well, I'm here to tell you that vision is our primary threat detector. So we've got this endless loop mantra in our subconscious mind that's asking itself the question, do I feel safe? Right? Endless loop tape. Well, I'm here to argue that if you can't see fast enough, that goes back to magnocellular vision, and somewhat by default binocular vision, if you can't see fast and use your two eyes together as a coordinated team, when your subconscious mind asks itself that question, do I feel safe? It can't answer that question fast enough. And you know the expression better safe than sorry. Well, if you can't answer that question fast enough, then you better go on high alert status. So your subconscious mind goes to tug on the shirt sleeves of your conscious mind. And basically your subconscious mind is doing this. Hey, 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 hey. And your conscious mind is like, what do you want? I'm supposed to be paying attention to the world around me. And the subconscious mind is like, do we feel safe? I don't know. I can't tell. I can't see fast enough to decide that, so I don't know the answer. And then the conscious mind has got to weigh in, right, to make peace with the subconscious mind. And then the conscious mind puts all of our sensory systems into DEFCON 1. Threat is imminent. And now you're going to get diagnosed with a sensory processing disorder, because all of your sensory systems are on high alert status, because your brain is wondering, where's the next threat going to come from? And I know that you all know this, but I'm going to say it anyway. When we look at many of these school age kids and we're like, oh, you know what? If Johnny would just pay attention, if Susie would just pay attention, I know she's capable, or he's capable of so much better work. And then we come along and we say, well, you know, you should go and look at this 14-factor model, because little Johnny or little Susie is paying attention, but not in the way that you want. So you're right. They don't have access to learning attention because they've been pushed to be in a perpetual state of fight or flight. So they're in survival attention. And your brain, of course, is going to pick survival over learning 110% of the time. And until we understand this model and until we fully comprehensively assess these kids in this manner, we're not going to make the strides that these kids are capable of making. And I want this to be abundantly clear, because our mission at the end of the day is that we want to improve our patient or our client's quality of life. And we can't do it if it's based upon missing and faulty data. And again, I don't care if you're 90 years old, 40 years old, had a brain injury, or you're a school age kid. If you need this help, you need this help. And if you don't ever get all these skills assessed, you don't know if you need the help. So stress and anxiety is a big deal. And don't get me wrong, are there other reasons that somebody could be experiencing stress and anxiety? Well, yes, of course. If you're a school-age kid and you've seen one of your parents be violent with the other, then you've experienced what are called adverse childhood events, and it upregulates your survival attention and your stress and anxiety. But my point, and if you've got genetic predisposition gut issues, or you've got gluten sensitivity, but you don't know it and you're eating the heck out of gluten, or you eat too much sugar, or you eat too much whatever, the things that aren't healthy for you, and if the bad bacteria in your gut outpopulate the good bacteria, your body and brain and gut can't produce and use the normal neuro-calming, attention-providing, thinking neurotransmitters that we need to be in a calm, alert, aroused state. And then at the end of the day, our body's physiologic response to stress is the same regardless of what's inducing the stress. So you could have motor stress, auditory stress, visual stress, and it's why I named my podcast Move, Look, and Listen. Because if you can't move, look, and listen in a fast, accurate, effortless, sustainable, age-appropriate, meaningful way, you're going to be in a world of hurt. And so we've got to make sure that you can move, look, and listen in an age-appropriate, meaningful way. Auditory processing, number 11 on the list. Well, let's be abundantly clear. The testing that's required to diagnose a central auditory processing disorder is not the same testing like the TAPS, or the test of auditory processing skills, or the language side of the WISC, one of the intelligence tests. So when somebody says, oh, well, we had psych ed testing at school, my kid doesn't have an auditory processing disorder. I'm like, show me your testing. Yeah, they didn't do dichotic listening. They didn't do temporal processing. They didn't do pitch discrimination or pitch duration, and so on and so forth. So that's not the same as a central auditory processing disorder. And Paula Talal, way back in the day, going back probably to the mid 80s, early 80s, somewhere in that window, her and a professor at I think UC Berkeley, maybe UC San Francisco, I've forgotten. Right, they published a program called Fast for Word. And I remember reading work from Paula Talal years ago, and her talking about Fast for Word as a representation. Okay, you ready for this? Magnocellular auditory skills. And again, we're back to magnocellular motor, magnocellular auditory, magnocellular vision. And I'll tell you more about that in a few minutes. Primitive reflexes. I learned about primitive reflexes when I was in optometry school, but it didn't get emphasized, not nearly enough. And then when I first got out in practice, for probably the first 10 or 12 years, I would read about it, and I kind of danced around the issue, and I could never quite make my peace with it. But it was there nagging me in the back of my mind. And then it was one of those things where the universe set this in my path. Like I couldn't ignore this. And I have a couple other stories that are sort of like that. But what happened was primitive reflexes rattled around in my brain. I had collected resources from 4 or 5 different companies that write books and articles and have institutes and have training programs. And I had a lot of their materials, but I still couldn't fully make my peace with it. And then years ago, an optometrist from England was coming over to the U.S., was going to come to the optometry school here in Southern California. and mind you, I live about a mile from this optometry school. And this is where she's coming to do this talk. And I'm like, well, I have to sign up for this. I'm never going to get any closer unless she comes to my house and we do the course in my backyard. Well, I went to that 2 or 3 day course, and it was one of those things much like my epiphany with Interactive Metronome. And I came back to my office that following week, and I said, Doug, you're just going to have to roll up your sleeves. You're going to have to do this testing on kids and adults that come to the practice, and you're just going to have to get your feet wet and see what happens. And that's been, 12 or so years ago, and I've never looked back. And I've done other training with, for those of you who know, I've done training with Svetlana Maskatova, and I'm doing 2 of her other trainings coming up in the next month or so. I've done training with rhythmic movement training. And I've got resource. Oh, and then I went to Phoenix and did some training with an osteopath named Bruno Chikly, Chikly. And if you YouTube his name and put Bruno Chikly primitive reflexes, he's going to show you some mind-blowing stuff. It's just mind-blowing. So primitive reflexes has become part of my stage 1 therapy as this nutrition discussion. And the simplest thing that I would tell you today is to look up a company called BrainSpan, SPAN as in Nancy, brainspan.com. I started carrying this product in my office probably 3.5 years ago. If you go to the brainspan.com site as an example, and you're intrigued and you want to know yourself what your outcomes are, and you decide that the fastest way to find somebody and the most economical person who's going to do this is me, then you'll email me, or you'll probably email me, and we'll hook you up with a BrainSpan kit. I'll mail it to you. And here's the short version of it. So there's two parts to the BrainSpan testing. There's a link that you get that does some visual cognitive testing online, attention, processing speed, some component of multitasking. It's intriguing. And you get a kit that has a tiny lancet. You do a finger stick. You collect about 5 drops of blood on this blotter paper. You let it dry for 5 minutes. Stick it in the envelope. Mail it off this company in South Dakota. In about a week and a half, you and I both get a report that talks about 3 things. How's your body metabolizing carbohydrates? What's the ratio of omega-6 fatty acids to omega-3 fatty acids in your red blood cell membranes? And what's your AA to EPA ratio in your blood? Namely, what's the percentage of arachidonic acid in your blood versus eicosapentaenoic acid? And AA and EPA for arachidonic acid and eicosapentaenoic acid, that ratio should not be higher than 3-to-1, meaning that you should not have more than 3 molecules of arachidonic acid for every molecule of eicosapentaenoic acid. And in a perfect world, your ratio would be 2-to-1 or 3-to-1. The average American has a ratio of 20-to-1. Let that resonate for a second. 20-to-1, it's supposed to be no higher than 3-to-1. I'm telling you, we are giant bags of inflammation, and we're not attending to that enough medically. Partly because medicine doesn't talk about it. And I would venture to tell you that if you were to go ask your family doctor, hey, what can you tell me about this AA to EPA ratio? They're probably going to go, what are you talking about? They're not going to know. And yet here's this whole body of literature based around this number. And I tell you that because as an example, I could send you an article that specifically discusses omega-3 fatty acids, namely fish oil, in dyslexia, dyspraxia, dysgraphia, and ADHD and autism. And I could also send you an article that talks about magnocellular neuron function and getting an adequate amount of omega-3 fatty acids in your diet. So if your ratio is high, I could do therapy with you, but I'm not going to get the outcomes that your brain is capable of if this ratio is too high. And you know, you all know this expression, you are what you eat, right? Let food be thy medicine. I think Hippocrates said that years, like, you know, thousands of years ago. All health starts in the gut. So yes, gut function, microbiome, nutrition, primitive reflexes, and interactive metronome. That's stage 1 of my therapy plan. And there's one exception to that. And that exception is if I've done a long form screening from interactive metronome with you, and your outcomes are terrible, and you have trouble listening to my instructions while I am simultaneously demonstrating to your body, do this. And if I have to start and stop and restart and re-explain many of these therapy models, the 14 different tasks, if that's a monstrous challenge, I'm making generally the executive decision that you are not ready to do interactive metronome. At least not at home, because there's no way you're going to have the attention span to understand the feedback that you're being provided. And you are mindlessly going to be clapping at home, and your timing's never going to get better. And you're not going to have the clinical outcome I want you to have because your attention span is so poor you can't benefit from the feedback. So in that model, or in the situation clinically that I've just described, my default is to typically start with one of the music listening therapies, preferably with bone conducting headphones. And then we'll reassess down the road about, can you engage in the interactive metronome therapy and benefit from that feedback? And I'm hopeful that at the end of things, right, for those of you who are doing a different model, and if you will share with a group of us, it's like, oh, you know what, Doug? I know the kids you're talking about, but I have them come into the office and I do the hand-over-hand modeling with them for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 5 hours, 15 hours. And does it finally click for them what the feedback means? And can they now do the work on their own? Or if you've done 5 or 8 or 10 hours of hand-over-hand therapy, can you go back and do a long form assessment? And will that help them reset their timing clock or not? I need to know that, because again, if I know somebody can't do the work and can't benefit from the feedback, I'm not going to say to that family, yeah, you know what? Sucks to be you, but your timing is so terrible that I can't make it better. I'm going to figure out how I meet that kid at a place that they function at. I'm never going to tell a person, hey, look, I just can't help you. Now, and I have a couple of these kids that will not wear a pair of headphones, and I can't even get them to do the music listening therapy. So my default for that family would be, hey, you're really going to have to address this nutrition piece because your child's terribly dysregulated. And I think it's primarily driven through nutrition or environmental pollutants or lead or mercury or deficiencies in your zinc and copper ratios or magnesium or over-the-counter lithium and so on. So we need to get your kid in a better regulated state so that they can begin to participate in life in a better way.
Hey, Doug, if you don't mind, if I could just touch back on something that you mentioned previously.
Yeah.
That kind of goes into what you're saying here about, we're almost on number 14, genetic predisposition, but there is a question about, are there clients that you wouldn't recommend for IM at all? They come in, see you, and is there anyone that you would say, listen, you're not a candidate? I know we're touching on that subject a little bit right now.
Yep. Yeah. So let's reiterate. So if I have somebody who cannot easily participate in the long form screening, I'm making the judgment that they're not going to be able to sustain attention to actually do the IM therapy, right? Because in order to benefit from the therapy, you've got to be able to attend to the guide sounds or the visual guides and be able to do that rapidly enough that, so I'll take visual guides as an example. So to benefit from the visual guides, you've got to hear the reference beat. You've got to set the hand or the foot trigger off in anticipation of the beat interval. You have to watch the screen, see where your numbers lie, and then prepare to go faster or slower on the very next beat.
Right.
That is a lot of high level processing that you've got to do in a short amount of time.
All right. Another follow-up question to that. Now, is there instances where you'll say, I don't want to introduce guide sounds immediately, or I don't want to introduce visual feedback initially? Where do you draw that distinction with a client who either can't handle the auditory feedback or the visual feedback? Do you have them close their eyes? Do you have them turn around and not look at the screen at all? What are some of the scenarios you use with the assessment?
Well, this is why I appreciate being able to come and share this information and hear these kind of examples, because I need to hear more, and I would love to carry on this conversation with you in the next week or two, because I've made the decision clinically that if you are struggling so much just to do the long form assessment, that I'm not likely to prescribe IM use for you, but rather I'm going to default to one of the music listening therapies, because it's a more passive therapy. Now, and this is why I'm curious to hear from others in the group, and for you and I to carry this conversation on later,
Right.
because maybe what I should be doing is only having the person clap to the beat and not get any feedback. Let's just have them clap to a beat. But the reason that I've defaulted away from that is because my thinking is, if they're just clapping to a beat, but they're not getting any feedback that tells them if they're too fast or too slow, am I just embedding their bad timing into the neurology? And wouldn't a more productive use of time be to default to one of the music listening therapies? And it's also intriguing to me because I've also been I got trained and a provider for Stephen Porges's Safe and Sound program about 3.5 years ago, and its effects on helping kids self-regulate is pretty stunning. And so part of my model is that, and let's say that we're talking about one of the kids somewhere on the ADD autism spectrum,
Right.
and that they have difficulty self-regulating. Well, I'm here to tell you that if I can get them in a pair of glasses with prism and or color, and I get them to do 5 1-hour sessions, or maybe 10 30-minute sessions of the Safe and Sound program, between that program and my glasses, it's likely in most kids to immediately change their quality of life. And then I might have the kids that we're talking about right now, I tend to default to prism and color and a pair of glasses to help self-regulate, Safe and Sound program to help self-regulate, do one of the listening therapies whether it's ILS or TLP. Those are the two that I'm trained in, and there are others, I understand that. But what I haven't had I don't even remember the last time I have had somebody start in that model and then come back after doing the listening therapy for maybe 6 months to 9 months, and then repeat the interactive metronome screening and see if they're in a place now to benefit from the therapy. I haven't had that experience yet, and I'd be curious to know in the chat box if anybody has had that experience and what has happened. So again, just to reiterate, if I made the judgment that they can't engage in IM as a therapy, then I'm going to default to nutrition, glasses with prism and color, primitive reflexes, and the nutrition piece.
Gotcha. Now, along those lines as well, when you're charging for IM services, what is your kind of long-term and short-term pricing model look like? If you see you have a kid, he is a candidate, how are you pricing IM home or your in-clinic sessions? I know that's a big question for providers. Well,
I'll tell you this manner. So before IM home existed, I had a vision therapist that had trained with me for many years, and when we only had the in-office version, we did in-office therapy because it was our only choice.
Right.
And we were doing some other therapies in conjunction with IM. So way back when, and this is probably 12 years or so ago, maybe longer now. But we might do in-office IM, magno, cellular, and binocular vision, and maybe we would weave in some working memory activities at the same time. But my vision therapist ultimately had to leave to take care of her dying husband and then didn't come back to the office. And it was weird because right around that same window, I Am Home came out. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what a blessing. So I took to that in a heartbeat. And so my model at that point was, hey, if your timing's that poor, and again, we go back to my stage 1, nutrition, primitive reflexes. If they're not integrated, invariably they're not. And I'm going to have you do this work at home. And so I charge a flat fee for the hardware and software, an initial training visit, usually 2 or 3 in-office visits to reassess other skills that I want to know if, like other things in my 14-factor model, are these other things getting better by having done the work that we're describing now at home? And then these parents also have ready access to me by phone, text, or email. If something comes up and they've got issues, then they have ready access to me. And then as you, well, again, for those of you that know, every time a student finishes an I Am Home lesson, you get an email that says that they finished a lesson. So you can look up their data and see how they're coming along and see if you need to modify anything or that. So I just charge one flat fee.
Nice. And do you find more private pay or insurance or a mixture of both? What's more prevalent?
Well, so here's where it gets interesting, because I don't, because this model that I'm describing is one global fee, it doesn't lend itself to insurance billing.
Okay.
And then there's another part to insurance billing that it's just annoying. So for example, and for the OTs and probably even the speech people in the group, you're familiar with the 99,000 codes, 99712 or 112. Anyway, they're in the 99,000 codes. And those are neuro rehab codes. It doesn't say anything about that being a PT or an OT code. It's a neuro rehabilitative code. Well, I do neuro rehabilitation. It's what I do. And the last time I checked, Blue Shield said, they had a policy said, oh, well, you're an OD, you can't bill that code. And I'm not going to fight with that.
Right.
So if I have somebody that says, well, is that billable to my medical plan? No. I'll give you the receipt. You can submit it if you want to. I don't think they're going to pay for it.
Right.
Because your medical plan is likely going to tell you it's educational, or it's investigational, or it's experimental, or we don't pay that code when an optometrist provides it.
I see.
So I don't, and then you get in the whole place of service billing, right? So if I'm having people do work at home, right, and I bill it as place of service as home, that's invariably a red flag to deny it.
I see.
And so I don't bother.
Okay.
What I do have more success with is getting school districts to fund it through an IEP or a 504 plan.
Nice.
And so I've had a lot of success doing that. Excellent. And it oftentimes doesn't come without a fight. And I know a number of advocates over the years, a handful that I particularly like, and they're really good at what they do. And school districts just need to be brought to the table to realize what their responsibilities are and how they're supposed to pay for related services, so that a child who has an IEP or a 504 plan can access the curriculum in a similar way to their non-disabled peers.
Excellent.
Is that helpful?
Absolutely. And on that line of questioning, how do you market to schools specifically, or what is your marketing plan as far as language?
No, because school districts do not like me. And the reason they don't like me generally, well, but let's be clear. Classroom teachers love what I do.
It's the administrative.
Yes, the administrators do not.
Right.
And of course, classroom teachers love what we do because it helps their kids.
Right.
And it ultimately helps the classroom teacher because the kid's more participatory and less disruptive.
Right.
And it boosts the kid's ego because now they get to have success in a way that they've only been experiencing abject failure and misery. So yes. So administrators don't like what I do, and probably others on the list, but primarily because they don't like somebody looking over their shoulder and pointing out their failings in where they're not following the law.
Fair enough. Yeah, I would probably be a little upset as well, but that definitely answers the question. And other than that, do you do any other specific marketing to bring I Am Home clients to your practice?
Well, that's what's the interesting. No, the answer to that is I have not, because I've been so busy otherwise that I haven't gone out of my way to hire a third party to work with to try to market my practice in that manner.
Okay.
And I haven't carved out the time to do it because I've been so busy that I can't carve out the time to do it.
Well, busy is always good, so there's no argument there. What's the favorite thing about IM that's done for your clients? Have you seen remarkable results with certain individuals?
So here's what's interesting about that question. Now, I'm gonna circle back to answering it, but I'm gonna do it in this manner because I've had people, I don't know, some parents, some teachers, some administrators. They're like, "Well, Doug, I've heard vision therapy doesn't work. Like, we're not going to fund it. I've heard it doesn't work." And I say, "Doesn't work to do what?" And they're like, "What do you mean?" I'm like, "What do you mean? You're the one that said it didn't work. I'm asking you, it doesn't work to do what? Cure world hunger?" I agree. Vision therapy will not cure world hunger. Will it change somebody's focusing, tracking, teaming, visual perceptual, visual motor, visual postural, visual auditory, visual cognitive, visual spatial skills? You bet. Hands down, it'll do that.
Right.
Will it suddenly make a kid a better reader? Maybe. But I'm not doing therapy to do that. That kid still has to be taught the abstract symbol systems of reading and math, right? So I try to frame it out and say, let's be on the same page about what we're talking about so that either you agree to my plan and embrace it and I teach you enough that you get where I'm coming from, or don't start with me. Don't start with me. But so as an example, I mean, and believe me, in fact, I just sent off to an advocate and a parent today, IM's website, specifically the link that goes to the research publications, because I have a school district right now that is balking about this kid's therapy and about reimbursing his grandmother, who used to be a teacher in this district, about things that she had paid out of pocket for because she didn't want to drag on this whole IEP process with her grandson because she knew he needed help right now. So for those of you who are familiar with interactive metronome research, you know that there's some studies about reading outcomes and math outcomes and attention outcomes. And so I think all of those things are true. But again, if we go back to my 14-factor model, I point out, I say, look, this therapy is going to reset this timing clock. what your kid's brain does with the resetting of this timing clock, this is how I think it's going to show up. But let's be realistic. There's other factors at play. So here's what I know. I know that barring some major problem with your kid's attention, if they can pay attention to the feedback, they're going to reset their timing clock, and they're going to do it fast, because this technology is so powerful and yet so simplistic in its design that your brain is going to reset that timing clock in probably 30 to 40, maybe 15-minute sessions. And once we reset that clock, I think it's highly unlikely. I think there's no evidence that says your brain's going to unravel that timing clock once we reset it. Sometimes, and I tell them, sometimes your eye focusing, eye tracking, eye teaming skills may get better. That's in stage 2, right? Stage 2 in my therapy plan is eye focusing, tracking, teaming, magnocellular vision. That's in stage 2. Stage 3 is a working memory and executive function. Stage 4 is really reading and aspects of phonological processing, but really reading and math.
Right.
So we are starting in stage 1. And I'm not going to kid you. My job is to help your kid reset your timing clock, then reassess needs in stage 2 and stage 3. And if your brain was allocating much of its attention to dealing with this timing clock deficit, and we reset it, and now you're taking a lot of those attentional resources that were drained over here, and you have them to allocate to higher order skills in the ladder, well, focusing, tracking, and teaming and working memory may spontaneously get better because you're able to reallocate attentional resources in a way you couldn't before.
Right. And that, unfortunately, Doug, our time is burned through pretty quick. We're at about 9:20. We did start a little late, so I have to say we could go on, I think, for a few more hours, and maybe we'll have to do a part 2 to this. I know we did plan an hour block. There are some questions on the board, if you don't mind answering a few of these before we do terminate.
Oh, absolutely. And you know what I'm surprised by? I am surprised how fast this time went.
It does. It goes fast. So we will definitely do a part 2 to this this webinar, because I learned a lot just from hearing, and every time I speak with you, I learn a lot. So
okay,
everybody on the list here is gaining something from this. But if you want to go ahead and start the questions, or do you want me to read them out?
Nope. So here's question number 1. Do all of your clients do IM through IM Home? I mean, yes. The answer to that is yes. Because of the model that I've just described to you. And I like this model because let's go back to this idea of neuroplasticity. How does your brain get better at doing a task? 1, I have to teach you what the task is. 2, you have to do the task with cognitive effort. 3, you have to do the task with the right feedback. And 4, you've got to do it with enough repetitions to get your brain to change itself. And this is why this model, at least for me, has worked so wonderfully, because as I say, look, if you go home and do this 15 minutes a day, 5 days a week, you're doing 75 minutes of therapy on getting your brain to change itself. And I think that, and for some people who are game and their kids are up for the task, I do tell them, I'm like, look, you can do more than one 15-minute lesson a day. You could do up and do an hour a day if it's enjoyable and not tortuous, and you'll compress that 12 or 15 hours of therapy into no time flat.
2 weeks, right?
So yes, I personally don't do in-office IM therapy anymore, because for me, this model makes sense. And I do want these kids to get better fast. And that's true for vision therapy too, by the way. So this is rare, but I've had an occasion where a parent says to me, well, Dr. Steffi, I want to come and drop my kid off once a week. You do therapy here and I don't have to do anything at home. And I'm like, I'm not even going to take you on as a new patient. And you know why? Because your kid's not going to get better.
Right.
And then you're going to complain to me that I charge you this much money and your kid's not getting any better because you didn't do the work at home. So there's well, again, from a vision therapy standpoint, I don't think there's any vision therapy providing optometrist that says you only have to come here once a week and there's no work that you have to do at home.
Right.
I think there may be some offices that say, look, you can come here an hour or two a day and we'll power slam through much of this work in 2 weeks. But otherwise, maybe it's once a week and you do work at home 20, 30 minutes a day. But again, you've got to do the repetitions with the feedback so that your brain actually changes itself. And then related to metronome beats while doing movements. Yes, powerful. I will grant you that. And much of my working memory therapy, the kit of materials that I've put together to work on working memory also uses a metronome. So for example, if I'm going to have you do some Stroop-like task being the colored word things that you've seen before, where don't read any of the words, just name the colors. Well, let's say I've got a whole page of that. And my task is, hey, you know what? On the first word, read the color, then name the word. On the next, then read the color, name the word. And do it to every other beat, set at 100 beats a minute. That's high-level stuff. And I found generally that if you've got an interactive metronome problem, that you find it difficult to use the metronome beat with other activities. And I'm not saying that you don't make gains by using a metronome with other movement activities, whether they're brain gym or ballet-physics or the Learning Breakthrough program from the guy up in Washington State who I'm pulling a blank on. But nonetheless, I think that interactive metronome, again, because of the feedback down to a millisecond level, it brings something completely different to the table.
Yeah.
And then there's a question about the rural Midwest. Well, thank you for that, because I grew up in a small farm town in central Illinois, and do I understand that lots of people back in the Midwest eat a lot of carbohydrates and drink a lot of soda? Yes. And I would venture to tell you that their AA to EPA ratios are likely to be off the chart. And the thing that I love about the brain span test is that numbers don't lie. Like, we could talk till we're blue in the face about nutrition. It doesn't mean that someone's going to change their behavior. And I learned a long time ago that people change their behavior in one of two different ways. Either they know enough information and they can't hardly go back to their old behavior, or they heard enough to want them to change their behavior. So in that regard, I don't know hardly anybody in my practice who've done the brain span test who then doesn't listen to me about changing their diet. And sometimes, and I try to make it easy for some people, I say, look, well, and let's understand this too. When you're a slave to carbohydrates, don't think that you're just not being willful enough, and don't be guilty about it. Let's be clear. Your GI tract is overrun with bad bacteria. It has outpopulated the good bacteria, and the bad bacteria loves sugar and carbohydrates. So you're a slave to the bad bacteria in your GI tract. And when I finally understood that some years ago myself, it helps me look at my belly and think to myself, you are not going to get the best of me you bad bacteria, and I'm going to starve you out by doing the things that I need to do so that I can reduce my gut inflammation and by default reduce my brain inflammation. So I could not encourage you enough to become familiar with the brain span test and what it represents.
Mm.
And then let me look at another question here. So yes, for those who can't start or can't continue Interactive Metronome, well, I would suggest a couple of things. One is, if you haven't been doing IM Home, to consider that, because it makes it a more cost-effective model than the in-office version. And I suppose games like Guitar Hero or Dance Dance Revolution from some years ago is like a poor man's version of Interactive Metronome. So that would be reasonable. And David, this is for you. If you were to email me separately tonight or tomorrow or sometime, I'll come up with some other ideas about, anyway, some other thoughts. But again, do I think that clapping to a metronome or doing other activities like the other question asked about, is it better than doing nothing? Yeah, absolutely. And I've done this on occasion. I haven't done it for a really long time, but years ago, I remember I had asked a couple of autistic families, it's like, hey, when your kid gets up in the morning, download a metronome app on your phone, set it at 54 beats a minute, and just let it play in the background. And do that for a week or two, and see if your kid has an easier start to the day if you just let this metronome play in the background. And I would tell you that for a good portion of them, the kids were more regulated and life was calmer for everybody in the morning.
Interesting.
Let's see. Who do you consult for the nutritional piece? Well, the brain span kit is simple enough. That's straightforward. And if you were to email me, I will give you the name of a couple books. And I'll tell you one right now. Cure Your Child with Food by Kelly Dorfman, Dorfman. Kelly was a guest on my podcast in season 2. And her website is called kellydorfman.com. She does remote consults. I've got another book at home whose title I've forgotten offhand. That person does remote consults. Anyway, I could come up with some resources, and maybe what I'll do is that I'll come up with some book titles and maybe a couple websites and a couple of other organizations, and maybe put it together in a handout that I can email to Troy and Bricole. And if they can add it into this, you can download it from there, right?
That sounds good. Good plan to me.
And then, how much is a brain span test, and can anyone administer it? The answer to this, yes. When I give somebody the brain span test, I give them the kit and they have them go home and do the finger stick themselves. I don't do it in the office. You can call the company or contact the company and find out, with your background, will they let you be a brain span provider? And you could order the kits and dispense them yourself. I think many offices charge between $200 and $250 a kit. I charge $130, and I'm happy, to do that. And I give away some of my time for free to talk about the outcomes. I am a provider for a company called Standard Process, if you've ever heard of them. They're a Whole Foods company based out of Wisconsin. They have a sister company in Australia called MediHerb that make whole food supplements. And I want them to supplement their diet, even if they can't dramatically change their diet right out of the gate. If we can at least pump up the omega-3 fatty acids that they're getting, and getting enough of them, and then retest in 60, 70, 80, 90 days, redo the brain span test and look at their numbers change, it's very encouraging when the numbers change. And if they don't, then you have a discussion about, well, then you got to do more dietary changes. You can't think that you're going to drown out this inflammation with just fish oil. There's other things I think that are going to have to be considered. And let's see. For those that are interested about telephone consults, you know what, I'm migrating in that direction. And I have a couple people right now where I'm probably going to test drive what it's like for me to box up some of my testing. Some of it can be downloaded off the web. Some of it's physical stuff that I have to mail to you and basically do a clinical consult over Zoom or some other meeting like this. And yes, I think that's possible. And I'm still trying to figure out how I'm going to charge for that and what I'm going to charge. And then I'm going to bring up, if I can for just a minute. So Troy, did this letter come up that I've got here now?
It's up. Yes, I can see it.
Okay. So I've redacted this so that, and again, it's in, no, I don't think that this is in one of the handouts, but what I just want to show you real quickly is that here's the reason for the referral. Eye health, that's good. Visual acuity, refraction, if you're nearsighted, farsighted, have astigmatism, magnocellular vision, expected goal. You should be able to do this without headaches, dizziness, anxiety, eye strain. Then we're going to put a baseline about, well, how did you do? These are some of the test patterns that you see. The smaller circle in the middle, those stripes move to the right or the left, and then they get dimmer the more right answers you get. Binocularity, we're going to look at your ability to cross and uncross your eyes with this Vergence Facility prism. So I'm having you look at this target, put this prism in front of your eye. It makes the target go double, and your brain either has to diverge or uncross your eyes or then cross them. And I'm seeing how many times you can do that in a minute. When we do the testing with this Coit's target, you can sort of see that in this little circle over here at 12 o'clock, the figure on the right, there's a plus sign in there. So if I have you put on a pair of Polaroid glasses and I do the Vergence testing with the Polaroid glasses on, and your brain doesn't like crossing your two eyes, your brain's likely to shut one of your two eyes off. And if you see the vertical line with the right eye and the horizontal line with the left eye, and if you stop seeing the vertical line, then your brain stopped looking through your right eye. And on a related note, jump, near point of convergence. This is when I take a target, and it could be the end of a pin. I put it about 40 centimeters away from your face on your midline while you're looking across the room. And then I ask you to look at the tip of my pen. And I'll stop screen sharing in a minute, go back to the video and show you my own two eyes and what I'm talking about. And that's something that you could start doing tomorrow just to play around with this. And you're going to be amazed about what you see. Accommodative facility. What I'm doing is just scrolling through here to show you what my report sort of looks like. Ocular motor skills, that includes eye tracking and rapid naming speed. This grid drives a lot of people crazy. If you're prone to headaches, seizures, migraines, eye strain, motion sickness, get sleepy, tired, bored, lose attention when you read. Oh, and just so you know, I didn't say this yet today, but just so you know, if there's 130 people on this call tonight, I'm telling you, there's anywhere between 13 and almost 30 of you that have undiagnosed vision problems, whether it's magnocellular or binocular. So as a quick review, if you're prone to motion sickness, you're a jumpy front seat passenger in the car, sunlight and glare bothers your eyes, prone to headaches or migraines, don't like driving in the carpool lane when the concrete dividers whiz past your peripheral vision, bump into the corners of tables or edges of door frames, or when you read for more than 20 minutes, you get sleepy, tired, bored, lose attention, lose your place, skip over words or lines, or can't remember what you read, odds are you've got an undiagnosed vision problem. And you could tell me, well, Dr. Seffi, how could that be? I just went and had my eyes examined yesterday, and they told me I was 20/20, everything was fine. Because that exam included a 2-circle Venn diagram, 20/20 in healthy eyes, and it didn't address the third circle in this discussion, which is where all these other factors come into play. So again, working memory, phonological processing, word reading efficiency, right? Here we get into the good stuff. Interactive metronome, retain primitive reflexes, and then we're going to talk about whether or not those outcomes mean that you qualify or should qualify for an IOP or a 504 plan because you've got a visual impairment. I wrap it up with summary and conclusions, and then I start to list out this stage of therapies, right? All right, so let me hide that and see if I can get back to, I'm going to motor myself in here, take my glasses off so hopefully you can see my eyes a little bit better. Let's push myself up a little closer here. Okay, so I'm going to be the doctor and the patient. And so I say, I want you to look across the room, and then I'm going to bring this pencil tip down in about 40 centimeters away on the midline at eye level. And then I say, okay, stop looking across the room and look at the tip of my pen. And what's supposed to happen is that both eyes should turn in and look there. Now, I have control over this, and some people, their left eye is going to go off to the side. Or maybe it'll come in and go off. Or maybe it'll come in and push the other eye out. But what's supposed to happen is they're both supposed to turn in and stay there. And if somebody can't do that, that leads to this other discussion about these other questions, like the academic behavior survey that's in one of the handouts, or the convergence insufficiency symptom survey that's one of the handouts. And then you can help that family, if it's a school-age kid, you can help that family understand, hey, is your kid at risk for having these kind of problems? Separate from or in addition to their basic millisecond timing clock. So just to clarify, there is virtually no one that I do this kind of testing on that doesn't get an interactive metronome screening. It's everybody. And if your timing clock is off, that is one of my first therapies for you. And then I want to go back and because I realized something, and I need to go back and at least tell you this. So my experience so far is that out of the 14 different activities in the long form assessment, I have found the most challenging to be the both heels task. More so than the bilateral integration task of right hand, left toe, or left toe, right hand. I found the both heels task the hardest one to do. And I'm curious for anybody that wants to chat in the box if you found that to be similar. And my supposition is that both heels is an extraordinarily novel task that we don't do. And because it's a novel task, it's really challenging that motor planning and sequencing ability to, in fact, motor plan and do it in time. So at least when we're normally walking, that is a bilateral integration task. Right hand swings forward, left foot moves forward. So anyway, I'm curious to know if you have similar experience. I mean, there's some kids and some adults that I just end up discounting the both heels outcome because it's so terrible they can't even do it, even after I repeat and demonstrate it like 4 or 5 times. All right. So Is there anything else that we should talk? I can't believe how fast this time went.
It goes quick, I have to admit. And let me tell you, Doug, I do want to do another one of these because this was fascinating for me. And I hope it was for all in attendance. Every time I speak to you, I learn something new. So thank you very much for your time this evening. Thank you, everyone who's participated in this webinar. I hope you did gain some insight from Dr. Steffi about how IM is used. We do need to touch on a few other points in our next discussion. So hopefully, Dr. Steffi, you're amenable to that future time, and we can get together and do another hour or hour plus session.
Well, I would be happy to, and not the least of which, I think what this audience probably really would like to hear about is more about how I have intersected with school districts and IEPs and IEP meetings and 504 plans and independent educational evaluations and what parents' rights are.
So I think we found our next topic then, yeah?
Yes, I would love to come back and share that.
Fantastic. Doug, thank you again. And everyone else in attendance, we appreciate your time tonight and look forward to the list of books. So future reading or any other resources that you may want to share with us, Dr. Steffi, we'd be more than happy to put that in the recorded version of this webinar, which will be available in probably a week or so. Everyone will get a link, and we do encourage you to look through the attachments that Doug has shared with us this evening. And by all means, any questions that you have, I think Doug did extend the courtesy of having you email him to answer any questions and get more information if you need it. And if you need any answers from Interactive Metronome, I'm certainly available to answer questions for anyone that has them. So thank you again, Dr. Steffi. And if you want to close with anything, you're more than welcome.
I do. I want to close with, if you haven't found my podcast, go find it. Just type in Doug Steffi podcast on Google. In season 2, I have an episode with Amy Vega, who's the clinical advisor for Interactive Metronome. So I think you'll find that interesting. In season 2, there's an episode on independent educational evaluations and on IEPs with an educational attorney I know and respect. Excellent. And then the founder of BrainSpan was a guest on my podcast in season 2, so you can learn more about BrainSpan that way. And I would simply ask that you take advantage of the podcast. I did it for just this purpose. Post it on social media, give it to your families. There's lots of information to be gleaned, and if you're like me, you can never know too much, and we'll continue to seek out and find this information because we want our clients and our patients' lives to be better. Sure. And thank you for the opportunity to come and share this. That was wonderful.
Thank you, Dr. Steffi. And thank you, everyone. And that will conclude our webinar for this evening. Have a wonderful night. Everyone stay safe.
Bye now.